Tonight we begin with something quieter and stranger than usual. The complete story of schizophrenia. The long and often sad tale of minds that can feel torn apart. Forget what you have seen in films. This is not a neat story of split personality or a romantic view of madness. The real history is messy. It is full of medical theories, moral judgments, fear, compassion, and countless misunderstood lives. To live through this in past centuries was exhausting. If you were placed in a 19th century's asylum, your first night would be a trial. Take a moment to like and subscribe if this interests you. Share your location and the time where you are in the comments. I love seeing where our community is. Silence your notifications, take a breath, and let us begin. In the ancient light of the first cities, the world smelled of wet mud and baked bread. Gods walked the edges of every field. Strange minds were seen as forces to be reckoned with. In Mesopotamia, two kinds of people answered the call: the healer who used herbs and the priest who spoke to the unseen world. This was a practical choice, not a sentimental one. If a man had a fever, he got medicine. If he stared as if listening to another city, the priest would try to drive out demons. Evidence of this splits it on museum shelves today. Ancient tablets list symptoms, recipes, and prayers. They asked, was this illness a ghost, a spell from a neighbor, or something to fix with diet? The ancients were not just superstitious, they built systems. They made paperwork for the human condition. Healing was a community project. If gods were angry, rituals could win back their favor. The village paid for the rites. If a person was dangerous, they were secluded. A locked room, a bed in a temple, a caretaker paid in grain. Sickness could cost a family its harvest labor, so the community offered both support and control. The point was practical, to protect people and property, to keep order. In Egypt, the scene felt different but worked the same. Scrolls listed spells and potions with great detail. Remedies for nightmares, charms for a troubled mind. Egyptian healers mixed aromatics with prayers. They saw madness as a disorder of the household and the cosmic balance, not just the body. Their treatments also involved the community, ritual, food, touch, and family, calling the soul back. Greece changed the terms but kept some old ways. In the temples of healing, the language slowly shifted from demons to natural causes. Hippocrates argued that some disorders like epilepsy were brain diseases, not sacred visits. This idea loosened the grip of the gods on medicine. The theory of humors took over. It said the body had for key fluids, blood, phlegm, yellow bile, black bile. An imbalance caused illness. Too much black bile brought deep sadness. Too much blood or air brought agitation and mania. This was not just metaphor, it guided public health. The response was a regimented plan. Diet, exercise, baths, bloodletting, sometimes a move to the seaside. The cure required manpower, food, supplies, and a place, often a temple or a home. Clinical observation became a skilled craft. Doctors wrote clearly about patients who refused food, hid from people, or spoke of things not there. Later, Gale unlinked body fluids with anatomy and personality. He saw the brain as a theater where reason and madness played out. Greek medicine kept both the ritual and the rational. Dreams and divine signs stayed alongside baths and diets. The state and the family carried the load of care. Ancient cities created a patchwork of remedies that worked through social organization as much as medicine. This is key because they used scarce resources wisely. A city could support a doctor or a priest, maybe both. Temple economies were early hospitals. They took the sick in exchange for offerings. During plague or famine, they expanded, making wards and storerooms, borrowing labor from temple farms. Madness was handled where the sacred met the practical. The first patients in history show us people building systems, roles, payments, rituals, hospital wings, and record. They listed symptoms: withdrawal, hallucination, confusion, so later generations could see patterns and name them. The words on those lists survive, and with them a plan for care. When Rome fell and Europe entered the medieval age, some plans faded, others were kept in unexpected places. In Christian Europe, the language of the Spirit returned. People who might have gone to a temple were now seen as souls in danger, vessels for evil spirits. Exorcism came back with full force. Priests' relics, prayers, and legal processes defined who the church could treat. A man talking to empty air might see a priest as easily as a doctor. Healing was about community and order as much as the body. Monasteries and cathedral hospitals took in the sick. They offered sanctuary within prayer and basic care. They also offered a form of custody. The cloister demanded obedience, routine, and silence. It did not allow disruption. For families, locking a troubled relative in a monastery cell was simple. It removed danger and controlled cost. While Western Europe turned to holy containment, other regions built structures that shaped later medicine. The Islamic world from the 9th century preserved Greek texts and revived their clinical ideas. In Baghdad, scholars translated and debated the works of Galen and Hippocrates. The term by emergence, meaning place of the sick, came to mean hospitals with wards and specialists. Doctors like al-Razi wrote from observation. His notes show a sharp eye for psychiatric problems. He described mania, a deep sadness, and what we might call psychosis. He wrote about restraint and comfort and argued for humane care. A century later, Avicenna placed mental troubles in a full medical framework. He described obsessions, mania, and melancholy. He proposed practical treatments, baths, drugs, and talking. These doctors organized with a bureaucrat's eye. Wards were separated, staff were appointed, supplies were tracked in ledgers. Public hospitals in cities like Baghdad and Cairo had rooms for those the city found difficult. They offered gardens, crafts, repetitive work. They used music and cleanliness as therapy. Islamic hospitals were not just kind places, they were administrative projects. They were the medieval state's answer to minds gone astray. Two paths were set: containment in Christian Europe and hospital medicine in Islamic lands. Legal structures hardened community choices about custody. Secular courts and church authorities each claimed power. When a man could not manage his lands, the lord or king stepped in. When a woman upset her parish, church officials might demand exorcism. Laws were a local patchwork, but they set a key principle: the community had a stake. Responsibility meant power, power meant record control of property, and often the right to confine. By the year 1000, Europe knew institutions that sheltered and controlled. The Islamic world knew hospitals that tried to cure through clinical practice. The medieval mind began to wake again when printing spread ideas. The Renaissance brought classical doubt back to Western medicine. By the 18th century, people thought madness could be contained by law and treated by enlightened medicine. But the way care was delivered changed with the philosophy. Cities grew, economies industrialized, and governments had to make large choices. A temple could handle a few troubled souls, but a booming city needed bigger solutions. England shows this shift. A medieval priory founded in the 13th century later became the Bethlehem Royal Hospital. By early modern times it was called Bedlam. In the 17th and 18th centuries, private madhouses spread. City leaders worried about vagrancy and disturbance. The state tried regulation. The Madhouses Act of 1774 tried to license and inspect private places. It admitted an uneasy truth: there were many providers and no good standards. The Act's solution, form certificates inspections, was an early try to turn care into governance. It was clumsy but earnest. At the same time, a new moral vision took hold among reformers. They believed chains and cruelty were not only wrong but made things worse. In revolutionary Paris, a young doctor named Philippe Pinel got a post at the Btre hospital. The story often told is of Pinel in 1793 removing chains from patients. It is part myth, part history. The superintendent had already begun unchaining patients before Pinel arrived. But Pinel gave the action theory and language. Treatment based on dignity, walking conversations, structured work, and clean clothes proved both moral and practical. Pinel's writings created a new way of speaking. To be civilized was to remove iron from human wrists. His student Esquirol turned this humanitarian talk into professional terms. He defined different types of madness. The hospital became a lab for classification as much as cure. In England, the Quaker William created a model without chains. The York Retreat, founded in 1796, was a small private asylum run on Quaker principles. It had gardens, quiet, routine work and social discipline. Its success, especially with middle-class patients, gave a template for others. Across the ocean, an American named Dorothea Dix campaigned in the 1830s and 40s. She traveled the young nation, listing terrible conditions. She persuaded lawmakers that humane hospitals were a matter of public virtue. The result was many state hospitals built from the 1840s on. Scaling these ideals needed new logistics and administrative vision. How many beds, how many staff, how to feed hundreds who could not work for profit, how to fund heat and medicine through winter, how to track linen and drugs, how to design buildings that were airy and sunny, not damp and tight. Architecture became medical doctrine. Thomas Kirkbride proposed a plan in the 1850s. Long ventilated buildings linked to a central hub, sunlight, gardens, and wards to separate illnesses. The Kirkbride plan was a physical program. It assumed environment mattered and big institutions could be therapeutic tools. The design was built across a continent brick by brick. Administrators saw how to staff such places, where to put kitchens, how to get supply wagons. They created work, laundry, sewing, farming to feed the institution and give patients purpose. The economic case was strong. An asylum that grew its own food cut costs. Cost effectiveness justified public spending. Bureaucracy followed the buildings. Lunacy commissions and boards turned moral feeling into rules and registers. They required admission papers, case notes, set treatments, and annual reports. Numbers became tools of control. The patient became a record, diagnosis, age, job, family, state of mind on entry and exit. These registers let governments count people and justify budgets. They also let administrators rationalize exclusion. Some kinds of social trouble, vagrancy, poverty, were labeled mental disorder. The founders' moral drive hit hard realities. Cities overflowed. Industry broke families apart. Alcohol and urban poverty created more people who frightened their neighbors. Institutions meant for humane care filled fast, sometimes to double capacity. Moral treatment needed few patients per staff and individual attention. Reality was often high ratios, overworked staff and mercy lost to bureaucracy. Psychiatry professionalized on the same track. In France, the term aliens described a mind alienated from itself, a new specialist. France made classification systems. England made household guides. German-speaking lands built hospitals and a clinical psychiatry that split illness by prognosis. Clinics collected case stories. Asylums became not just refuges but research centers. Doctors wrote down symptoms and outcomes. They debated causes of deep sadness versus mania. They argued about work therapy versus water therapy, music versus sedation. More medical knowledge fed bigger institutions, and bigger institutions fed more knowledge. A loop. This loop had a dark side. Institutions need rules. Rules bring control. Control can become the goal. Where a doctor once argued for moral management talk, routine and dignity, administrations found it easier to make rulebooks, lock wards and process the poor who could not resist. Poverty, gender and unconformity, political protest found a convenient home in the asylum. Women who broke social norms easily were confined. Dissenters with breakdowns were diagnosed and walled off. Laws that let guardians be named for lunatics also allowed property to be transferred. It was efficient in bureaucratic terms and often meant well. The moral and the merciless twisted together. Think of a mid-century county asylum. Board minutes decided on expansions, builder contracts, orders for coal and blankets. A diet plan to feed everyone 3 times a day. A pharmacy ordering purgatives and tonics. Staff schedules for doctors, matrons, attendants, cooks and clerks. Teams to fix roofs and run the laundry. Workshops where men ended gardens or built furniture under watch. Sewing rooms where women stitched hospital linen. The ledger linked people to supply chains and the ledger decided who survived. Moneymen, county treasurers, parish boards decided how many warm blankets the sad child would get. The state's growing duty for its vulnerable meant mental illness became a public infrastructure matter. By the late 19th century, the asylum was a distinct social thing, a physical from a bureaucracy, a medical specialty, and a moral argument all at once. This institutional moment is key for understanding what came next. It made custody a national matter and made categorization normal. The same places that offered warm beds and some therapies created the terms that led to 20th century diagnoses. They gave doctors time to watch lung illnesses. They taught administrators how to manage populations. They trained many attendants who learned the rituals of controls, seating, feeding, bathing, counting behaviors, writing incidents in a log. There is irony in the reformed story. The very success of philanthropic institutions in expanding care made them vulnerable to pressures that turned humane care into management. The rush to build asylums in the 19th century solved a civic problem, where to put the unmanageable, but it also created a new institution of power with its own economies of scale. In a small retreated octa might sit with a patient and coax back habit. In a huge county asylum, the approach meant shift rotation, standard diets, and the economy of routine. Compassion in theory was often tyranny in practice. Even with pure intent, the moral and medical tangled. Classification systems once for scholarship became tools for administration. Names like melancholia, mania, monomania, dementia mattered because budgets and space were allotted by diagnosis. The public wanted order, administrators answered with classification. The result was an institutionalization of the mind that made some states visible to power and others invisible. A quiet breakdown in a rural home might never enter the ledger. A public scene, someone shouting in a market, could mean a certificate, a wagon, a ledger entry, and a bed. This asymmetry is a political fact of history. If you listen to these centuries as one long low song, a melody emerges. It is not simple progress or decline, but the repeat of a few themes. The try to name an experience, the try to decide who is responsible, the try to design places that can both soothe and contain. From the scratch of reed pens in Babylon to the prayerful hush of a medieval cloister. From the learned wards of Baghdad to the airy halls of a Kirkbride asylum, societies built tools for what they could not yet cure. The tools reflect their time, technology, theology, economy, and the scale of their social promises. They also hint at future science. Hospital registry that notes hallucinations and withdrawal is an archive. That archive becomes data for the next big shift in thought. So an ancient impulse to describe behavior to note. Its starting course planted seeds for later classification. That classification would try with finer and finer language to split the mind into diagnosable parts. All the while human scenes repeat. A mother bringing a child who cannot speak. A judge deciding on a small stipend for a ward. An attendant learning the rulebook for calming a restless patient at night. These are quiet operations, alarms in the night, kettles boiling, coal carts arriving at dawn. The remarkable thing is not that they happened in institutions, but that institutions recorded them. That clerks wrote names and dates, that doctors looked for causes and argued about cures, that state budgets heated wards in winter. That is how societies turn mystery into policy, slowly through paper, coal in the steady wash of linen. If the ancients set the categories and the medieval age set much of the talk and ritual, the 18th and 19th centuries set the institutional design and bureaucratic mechanics that shaped modern psychiatry. They made madness readable to administration and medicine. They also showed the constant risk when policy and compassion meet. Policy often wins in the long run. The moral treatment moment was a rare meeting of ethics and logistics. It needed few patients and much attention. When crowding came, the ethics frayed. This tension between humane hope and the demands of running an institution has followed the story of severe mental illness ever since. So the tale through ancient times, the Middle Ages, and the Enlightenment is not a steady march but a complex dance. Spirits, humors, and clinical observations all served as languages to make sense of the mind's rupture. Religious rites and custody were the first tools, hospital wards and clinical observation the next. Medieval thinkers and Islamic doctors kept knowledge alive in different tongues. The reformist zeal of the 18th century turned compassion into architecture and bookkeeping. Those buildings, temples, cloisters, hospitals, asylums were not just structures. They were social machines made to hold and heal, to hide and to study. In their walls we see how societies always had to do three things at once: name the problem, gather resources to meet it, and decide who pays. That practical three-legged stool shapes how the mind's fractures were understood, managed, and sometimes eased. Lay this story in your mind like the slow tick of a clock. A scribe by a lamp, a priest in a temple, a doctor taking notes, a Quaker arranging a garden, an administrator signing a form. Each act is small. Together they create the large, slow architecture of care. The history of the mind is as much the history of these acts as the history of ideas. Because without the bed, the blanket, the ledger, the warden, the law, even the kindest theory, is just an argument in an empty room. In late 19th century Germany, a man treated disorder like a mapmaker treats a land. He measured rivers, drew borders, and labeled what he could not yet name. Emil Kraepelin worked in universities from the 1880s to the 1910s, a man of neat habits and sharp notebooks. He wore out pencils on admission forms. He taught young doctors to look not at one symptom like a single flower, but at the whole garden over time, which plants lasted, which faded, which came back each year. Imagine his clinics in the late 1890s: long corridors, white basins, rows of case books like bank ledgers, and the quiet math of follow-up. Names, dates, the slow persistence of signs, and the final outcome were his daily work. Kraepelin-esque quiet revolution was this: mental illnesses should be sorted not by dramatic features shown in an hour, but by their coarsened final result. Symptom snapshots were unreliable. The path of a life was not. Over years he watched cases unfold. From this patient watching he drew to big provinces. One he called dementia praecox, an illness that started early, untended in his view toward decline, a premature dimming of the mind's light. The other he named manic depressive illness, which he saw as coming in episodes with recovery between storms and of peaks and valleys that could leaf out again. This distinction hammered into textbooks in the 1890s and early 1900s was less a theory than a scaffold. It shaped where research money went, where clinics were built, how asylums recorded the people at their gates. Kraepelin was both psychiatrist and bureaucrat. His method was systematic, his temperament was for sorting, his belief was that biology cast the longest shadow over mental life. He believed heredity and brain processes underlay the patterns he saw. He built institutions to study them. In Munich in 1917 he started what became the German Research Institute for Psychiatry. It married clinical observation to lab hope. It was a foundation stone for 20th century tries to anchor psychiatry to the body, to neurophilology, to blood and tissue, to the language of disease. The scale of Kraepelin-esque vision fit his age. Modern science must be measured, measurable, and, above all, sortable. He argued that if we could separate illnesses into reliable types, we could do more than comfort. We could study causes and find cures. His split dementia, a praecox versus manic depressive illness, was the working map for a century of study. Scientists looking for brain lesions, geneticists compiling family trees, doctors comparing outcome. It was not wrong to insist on coarsened outcome as critical data. The trouble no mapmaker could avoid was that the human mind does not obey neat borders. The scaffold Kraepelin built was necessary, but it kept some parts of the landscape out of view. Not far away in Zurich around the same time, another doctor asked a different question. Eugen Bleuler ran the Bergholz-Lee Hospital from the late 1890s into the 1920s. He saw similar patients, but did not accept Kraepelin-esque grim forecast. In 1908, he introduced a new name, schizophrenia. He gave it a careful meaning, not multiple personality, but a splitting of mental functions. His new word came with a conceptual shift. For Bleuler, schizophrenia was not just dementia starting young and ending in ruin. It was a disturbance in association. The threads that normally weave thoughts, feelings, motives end to one carpet. Bleuler liked precise concepts. He wrote of primary symptoms, the core disturbances inside the mind, and accessory symptoms, like hallucinations which could mislead by their drama. His famous terms, loose associations, blunted affect, ambivalence, autism, described the architecture of disorder. Loose associations meant logical bridges between ideas, weakened, producing speech that wandered like a river in marsh. Blunted affect meant emotions word old or mismatched. Ambivalence meant holding opposite feelings toward the same thing, maddening to those who wanted a clear reaction. Autism, in Bleuler's older sense, meant withdrawal into inner life, a retreat from the shared world. The Bergholz-Lee, in Bleuler's state, tiled wards, the smell of boiled starch, the whisper of staff, was also an intellectual salon. Carl Jung worked there using word association tests. Young doctors came to learn not just bedside care, but how to listen to disordered thought. Bleuler was open to new psychodynamic ideas without being ruled by them. He allowed a role for psychotherapy and refused to give final sentences on prognosis. His language was both clinical and kind. He hoped schizophrenia would remove the fatalism of dementia praecox and allow room for different courses and possible improvement. Bleuler's move was decisive and brought consequences he did not fully control. When a Zurich doctor chose schizophrenia to mean fragmentation, the wider world heard splitting thought of multiple people in one skull. The public mistake was vivid and stuck. Newspapers, novels, and films turned Bleuler's clinical metaphor into an image of a house with several tenants, not one person whose inner life had shattered. The word carried mythical weight, it invited fear and drama. In clinics, however, Bleuler's influence was subtler. He turned clinical attention to the fabric of mental life, to disturbances in association and feeling that needed new kinds of assessment and care. He taught doctors to look past dramatic hallucinations and see the quieter disruptions at the root of long disability. The debate between Kraepelin and Bleuler, course versus fragmentation, did not find a tidy answer. Instead, it became a back and forth that shaped psychiatry for generations. The pull toward biological taxonomy on one side and the pull toward psychopathology on the other. Both were right to insist on different truths. Both were vulnerable to their era's pressures. Kraepelin to the faith that disease maps would be found in tissue and genes, Bleuler to the risk of metaphors the public would misunderstand. By mid-century, as the world recovered from wars and medicine and learned about antibiotics and anesthesia, a new try was made to find useful markers for psychosis. Kurt Schneider, a German psychiatrist working from the 1930s, offered a surgical, to-love description, his list of first-rank symptoms. Schneider did not deny mental complexity, but sought a practical standard for the doctor's bedside. Which signs, he asked, were most reliably linked to what doctors called schizophrenia? His answer included experiences that could tip the diagnostic scales, hearing voices that comment on one's actions or talk to each other, the feeling that one's own thoughts are inserted from outside, the sense that thoughts are broadcast for others to hear, the feeling that one's will or movements are controlled by outside forces. These were not curiosities to Schneider, they were first-rank because they seemed to occur regularly in schizophrenia and felt peculiarly telling. Schneider gave doctors a toolkit. It was conservative and categorical because it aimed to improve shared language among physicians. Mid-century psychiatry, especially in North America and Northern Europe, appointed common words for common fact, so one hospital's diagnosis meant the same a continent away. Schneider's observation was practical and memorably simple. If certain subjective experiences recur often enough and are specific enough, they can serve as clinical signposts. After World War II, as psychiatry reorganized into departments and labs, these heuristics were welcomed with almost religious zeal by those wanting the field to be more like other medical sciences. The post-war era brought deeper forces to bear on diagnosis. In 1950, to French surgeon Henry Laborit reported the calming effect of chlorpromazine. Within years, the first antipsychotic swept in towards clinics, changing the logistics of care. Beds in long-term institutions began to empty as drug treatments, new social policies, and new expectations led to deinstitutionalization. In the 1960s and 70s, psychiatry moved with policy and pharmacology from chronic care warehouses to outpatient clinics and halfway houses. This movement needed administrative order. Insurance, hospital billing, government, tax and drug trials all required agreement on who had what. Around the same time, a different critique shook the profession. In 1973, David Rosenhan published On Being Sane Places, a famous experiment that showed the fragility of psychiatric labels. Sane volunteers were admitted to psychiatric hospitals after claiming two voices. The papers point that psychiatric diagnoses were sometimes shaky and shaped by institutional expectations caused outrage and shame. It was not the only push. Earlier in 1970, Robinson G. I had urged psychiatrists to set criteria so diagnoses could be validated by family history labs and long-term course. In 1970, Jaffaner and others published diagnostic criteria for research, offering short, practical lists of definitions for studies of depression, schizophrenia, and other disorders. The mood among clinicians and researchers became one of practical dissatisfaction and reformist energy. Diagnosis had to be standardized, replicable, and grounded enough to support both current biomedical research. Then came Robert Spitzer's, the third edition of the American Psychiatric Association's Diagnostic and Statistical Manual, published in 1980. DSM-3 was a sea change. Spitzer, a doctor with a taste for checklists and field trials, guided a manual that dropped much psychoanalytic language from DSM-2. It used operational criteria, a precise symptom lists, time thresholds, exclusion rules, and tried to be neutral about cause. Schizophrenia under DSM-3 now had clear criteria leaning on observable symptoms, duration, and impairment. It was a manual written in the language of inter-rater reliability. Committees, data and field trials promised to doctors in different cities could reach the same conclusion more often. The technical phrase haunting the story is reliability. For better or worse, DSM-3 traded some messy, rich, but inconsistent description for a reproducible slight modern medicine value. Reasons beyond knowledge pushed this path. Insurance companies needed clear codes. Clinical trials for new antipsychotics needed consistent rules. Researchers needed comparable groups to sequence genes, image brains, and test ideas. The psychiatric profession, eager to be taken seriously by other medical fields, wanted standards like cardiology or oncology. Politics inside the American Psychiatric Association were not immune to money and influence. Drug companies, government agencies, and professional ambitions all pulled levers. Anti-psychiatry critiques from thinkers like Thomas Shaw's to radical therapists had weakened psychiatry and psychiatry's public standing and pushed it toward defensible categories. Yet the trade-offs were predictable. Reliability got better validity, where the categories mapped onto real biological entities stayed stubbornly unresolved. Schizophrenia, as DSM-3 described it, became a useful clinical container. People with lasting psychosis impairing social function would be recognized everywhere. But inside that container was bewildering variety. Some patients responded well to antipsychotics and regained their lives. Others stayed impaired or had symptoms overlapping with mood disorders, leading to the messy category of schizoaffective disorder. Some showed disorganized thought and odd behavior, others paranoid delusions. Listing symptoms, durations, and rules flattened a thicket into squares on a grid. That flattening let science proceed. Epidemiology, imaging, genetics could use the categories to gather data, while possibly masking that categories were administrative conveniences, not natural kinds. Internationally, the World Health Organization's ICD series moved in parallel. By ICD-10, in the early 90s, many nations had diagnostic codes and rules mirroring DSM's push for standardization. Benefits were tangible. Multinational studies of schizophrenia's spread and course grew. Large genetic consortia could assemble thousands of cases because doctors everywhere agreed more or less on the name. clinical and scientific infrastructures funding research. Groups' regulatory expectations reinforced the manualized categories. In time, the very structure that enabled coordinated science began to shape practice. Treatment guidelines, drug formularies, and training programs assumed a diagnostic certainty, often more provisional than doctors admitted. Kurt Schneider's first-rank symptoms survived into this era as part of the clinical lexic, on a heuristic taught and used in research. Yet studies showed what some clinicians suspected: several of Schneider's phenomena are not exclusive to schizophrenia. Fault insertion in voices may occur in severe mood disorders and other psychotic conditions. The rigid hierarchy of first-rank symptoms failed to be a magic key. It proved one set of signposts, among many useful in some contexts, misleading in others. This is the neat cruelty of clinical tools. They work well used with new, unspurely treated as a final test. By the late 20th and early 21st centuries, the field was in a familiar talk. The manuals brought order, but not truth. The promise of biological markers had not yet become a simple blood test or brain scan for schizophrenia. Patients' lived experiences refused clean categorization. In response, new initiatives tried to rethink the very terms of inquiry. In the United States, the National Institute of Mental Health introduced the Research Domain Criteria, or RDoC, in the 2010s, an ambitious framework to study mental disorders across dimensions like cognitive control, reward systems, threat response, not as fixed DSM categories. RDoC is for research first and neutral about names used at the bedside. It gestures back to Kreppel and Ness' wish for biological grounding and forward to a science of mechanisms that might someday restore validity to categories reliability formalized. Meanwhile, the DSM itself kept evolving. DSM-3's descendants refined criteria, removed some subtypes, and tried dimensional measures. DSM-5 in 2013 removed the old subtypes of schizophrenia, paranoid, disorganized, catatonic, admitting their poor reliability and limited use. The manual's language began to admit what clinicians always knew in practice: schizophrenia is a spectrum, a varied set of phenomena, and needing individual assessment. Yet the manuals remain essential. Insurance, hospital admissions, research grants, and regulatory approvals still travel the roads DSM and ICD paved. The very fact they can be criticized for freezing practice shows their power. The political and professional forces shaping this path matter because they are often invisible in clinical talks. Psychiatric terminology is not just from classification committees. It is shaped by drug companies funding trials, government agencies deciding what gets paid for, activist movements fighting for or against interventions, and researchers whose careers rise with homogeneous samples. The big institutional shifts of mid-20th century deinstitutionalization, managed care, global biomedical research, all pushed psychiatry toward categories that could be counted, coded, and compared. These forces brought huge benefits: access to drugs, coordinated public health responses, and a shared language. They also created harms: over-reliance on checklist diagnosis, risk of pathologizing normal distress, and a tendency to prioritize what is measurable over what is meaningful to a person at the kitchen table. In the end, the line from Kreppel to Bleuler to Schneider to DSM-3 and the ICD is less a straight line than a braided rope. Kreppel and Ness' insistence on cause and outcome gave structure. Bleuler's reframing invited attention to psychic architecture. Schneider's practical symptom list offered clinical signposts. DSM-3's operationalization gave tools for reproducible research and bureaucratic action. Together they made modern psychiatry possible. They also made it partial. The same tools that allow giant gene studies and imaging consortia can obscure the uniqueness of a patient's life. Any clinician who has seen a manualized diagnosis fail to fit a person knows a small stubborn irony in this history. Kreppel, who prized the long view, set an agenda, asking for biological evidence and dependable categories. Bleuler brought back nuance and warned against early prognosis. Schneider sought clarity at the bedside, and the late 20th century reforms answered the call for reproducibility at the cost of some richness. The century that followed saw both healing and containment, scientific progress and contested meaning. The name schizophrenia, chosen to note a clinical observation of fragmentation, moved into common speech, where it often carries the wrong image entirely. Split personality walked out of clinics into film scripts and jokes. The clinical reality stayed more complicated and human than the myth. So when we speak of the mind breaking into, remember the phrase carries more than one kind of break. There is the break in continuity between observational psychiatry and a manualized one. There is the break in public imagination, clinical metaphor turned into sensational shorthand. There is most painfully the break many patients and families endure between the life they knew and the one they must now navigate, a break no manual can fix alone. Yet there is also quiet resilience. The history of diagnosis is a history of tries, some clumsy, some inspired to named suffering so it can be studied unease. Imagine the whole story as a long parade of lights moving down a European street from gas lamps to electric fluorescence. Each lamp lit of road, the next lamp enlarged or shadowed. Kraepelin set his lamp on course and outcome. Bleuler shifted his toward connection and fragmentation. Schneider placed his on certain bright symptoms, and the manuals that followed wired the street with dependable bulbs so carriages could pass at night without crashing. The light has been imperfect, but it mattered. It remains the doctor's task to walk these lit streets with humility, to know categories or tools, not final truths, and with courage to listen beyond checkboxes. To loose associations, blunted effect, the faint commentary of a voice, and the long arc of a life that refuses to be fully caught by any manual. There is dark humor in how psychiatry has traded metaphors, yet returns generation after generation to the same stubborn mystery: how to order a life that has become disordered. The books, committees, clinics, institutes, boxes on forms, all tries to bring structure to chaos with the quiet hope that once we name a thing we can fix it. It has not been that simple. But each step, Kreppel and Ness patient, records, Bleuler rest, careful shifts, Schneider's bedside heuristics. The manual's tries for consensus has been a strategy for moving forward, a logistical answer to a problem of enormous scale. The history they weave is not a tale of triumph, but a long, slow experiment in care, classification, and stubborn wish to understand how the mind can, as Bleuler said, come apart, and how the world might learn to sew it back together stitch by tentative stitch. While the age of somatic interventions began with insulin's chemical hammer, it soon discovered electricity in the surgeon's knife. Each carried its own stark logic, its own blend of hope and harm. Not long after, electricity offered a different kind of seizure. In the 1930 seconds, doctors observed that epilepsy and schizophrenia rarely occurred together. This curious fact sparked an idea: perhaps an induced seizure could calm a psychotic mind. First, chemical convulsants were used, violent, unpredictable. Then, in 1938 in Rome, Ugo C. Arletti and Lucio Bini introduced electrovocantus therapy, or ECT. Electricity promised control. Eye doctor adjusted dials. A current passed. The body seized in a controlled fit, then lay still. ECT spread far. Administrators liked its simplicity, no complex drug supply needed. Doctors liked its immediacy. Families, desperate, liked that something was being done. For severe depression and catatonia, it could be dramatically effective, pulling people back from the edge. In those cases, it felt like a mercy, but the harms were real. Early ECT was often given without anesthesia or muscle relaxants. Patients could fracture bones or lose memories, whole chunks of life vanishing into a fog, even as techniques improved with anesthesia in the 1950 seconds. The image of the electric shock as a tool of love, control, and coercion stuck in the public mind. It became a symbol of psychiatric power, a dark icon in books and films. The history of ECT is an idea, a therapy that can be both life-saving and terrifying. its story forever split between clinical utility and the shadow of abuse. Then came the most radical idea of all: if the mind was broken, perhaps you could cut the broken part away. In 1935, Portuguese neurologist Antonio E.G. Desmones performed the first prefrontal leucotomy. He believed the frontal lobes housed the circuits of worry and obsession, severing them might quiet a tormented mind. Using a tool called a leucotomy, he cut the white matter connections. Some patients grew calmer. In 1949, Desmones won the Nobel Prize, an award that would later become deeply controversial. In America, the procedure was popularized by Walter Freeman. He simplified it into the trans orbitos orbitolus orbitomy, using a tool like an ice pick inserted above the eye to sever frontal lobe connections. He traveled the country demonstrating the technique. It seemed like a quick fix for overcrowded asylums and desperate families. Tens of thousands were performed. The results were a haunting mix. Some patients did become less agitated, but many were left hollowed out, apathetic, childlike, their personalities fundamentally erased. Side effects included seizures, incontinence, and a profound emotional emptiness. The story of Rosemary Kennedy, who underwent a lobotomy at 23 and lived the rest of her life with severe disabilities, became a stark public lesson in the cost. By the 1950s, as the first antipsychotic drugs arrived, the crude era of lobotomy began to wane. Its legacy is a chilling reminder of a medical philosophy that prioritized control and manageability over the complex integrity of the human self. It showed how a desperate desire for a cure could justify an irreversible assault on the very essence of a person. This entire period, from insulin comas to lobotomies, was driven by a profound, often desperate, belief that mental illness was a mechanical fault in the biological machine of the brain. The goal was to reset, reboot, or remove the faulty part. The methods were old, sometimes helpful, often catastrophic. They left a deep scar in psychiatry's conscience, a permanent reminder of what happens when action outpaces understanding, and when the hunger for order overrides the duty to preserve the person. Then, in the early 1950s, the revolution arrived, not with a surgeon's blade or an electric jolt, but in the quiet form of a pill. The story of chlorpromazine typically begins with French chemist Paul Charbonnier, who synthesized the compound Rhone-Bulland in the early 1950s. Yet its psychiatric applications stemmed from a chance observation by surgeon Henry Laboret. During operations, he employed chlorpromazine to alleviate patients' shock and anxiety, noting that it not only induced sedation, but also produced a peculiar indifference. Patients appeared to lose the fervor of their reactions to hallucinations and delusions. In 1952, psychiatrists Jean Delay and Pierre Denisot at Paris's Hospital St. Minas and systematically administered chlorpromazine to psychiatric patients. Hallucinations diminished, agitations subsided, and a manageable calm descended upon the previously tumultuous wards. The drug entered the American market in 1950 under the name Thorazine, and the term miracle swiftly entered both professional and popular vocabulary. Chlorpromazine ushered in the era of antipsychotic drugs, marking not merely a pharmacological revolution, but a social one. For the first time, many long-term patients could be sedated, sometimes even returning to community life. Administrators calculated the freed -up government glimpsed the potential for vast institutional budget cuts. Families began to dare to hope. The pill reshaped expectations around recovery, responsibility, and normality. The pharmacology narrative became inextricably intertwined with neurocommercy. During the 1950s and 1960s, neuroscientists like Arvid Carlson began elucidating dopamine's role in the central nervous system. Subsequent research linked epistophics to the blockade of dopamine E2 receptors, The dopamine hypothesis of schizophrenia, positing that excessive dopamine activity in the mesolimbic system causes positive symptoms, became the dominant theory, though it never lacked for competition and refinement. As pharmacology matured, second-generation drugs emerged. Haloperidol, developed in 1958 by Belgian pharmacologist Paul Janssen, became the archetypal typical antipsychotic for the subsequent decade. These drugs were potent and effective for many, yet the side effect included acute dystonia, Parkinson's, minus-like symptoms, and the potential for tardive dyskinesia following prolonged use, an often irreversible disorder of involuntary movement that proved particularly tragic cost for some patients. The 1960 seconds and 1970 seconds saw optimism tempered by caution. Discovered in the late 1950 seconds and introduced in Europe during this period, clopamazine proved uniquely effective for patients unresponsive to earlier drugs, heralding a revolution. However, reports of agranulocytosis, a dangerous plunge in white blood cell counts, led to its withdrawal from many markets, or its use being subject to stringent blood monitoring protocols. The Cellini story, its brilliance, the caution it prompted, and its eventual return under strict supervision, such as its Ray- approval in the United States in 1989, encapsulates psychiatry's ambivalent relationship with pharmacology. Potent therapies must be accompanied by vigilant oversight. During the 1990 seconds and early 21st century, a class of called atypical antipsychotics, including risperidone, olanzapine, and quetiapine, promised control of psychotic symptoms with fewer motor side effects, potentially improving negative and cognitive symptoms too. The marketing apparatus embraced this narrative: better tolerability, broader symptom control, a return to life. Reality proved more complex. Atypical drugs often introduced another set of hidden risks: weight gain, metabolic syndrome, diabetes, and cardiovascular hazards. For some patients, these long-term metabolic consequences proved as life-shortening as the dyskinesias induced by earlier medication. Even with reduced positive symptoms, many patients continued to grapple with negative symptoms: emotional blunting, anhedonia, social withdrawal, and cognitive deficits, areas where the drugs proved limited in efficacy. Pharmacology has not only transformed symptom management but reshaped institutional policies and societal expectations. Medication shortens hospital stays and fuels the narrative that drugs alone can restore patients to work, family, and civic life. Policymakers and administrators cite pharmacology as justification for reducing inpatient beds. Pharmaceutical companies, with substantial promotional budgets, help shape the uncertain recovery through medication narrative through advertising and medical education. Yet medication alone seldom addresses the complex interweaving of social, economic, and psychological needs underpinning long-term disability. For some institutions, drugs represent chemical restraint for certain families. They constitute the only viable pathway to basic care. The overall effect has been a shift in psychiatric practice towards biological models. Psychiatry's self-image has transformed from that of asylum keeper and analyst to prescriber and neuroscientist. This shift has brought progress, but also introduced new forms of harms, side effects, over-reliance on medication, and the over-medicalization of suffering. If the era of drugs promised liberation from closed wards, the ensuing era of policy will require far more than pills to succeed. Institutionalization, a deliberate policy movement away from large psychiatric hospitals towards community care, accelerated from the 1950 seconds through the 1970 seconds and beyond. In the United States, the 1963 Community Mental Health Centers Act, championed by President John F. Kennedy, pledged federal funding to establish local centers offering outpatient, day treatment, and rehabilitation services. The aims were humane and modern, closing custodial institutions and establishing a network of community services. In Italy, psychiatrist Franco Basaglia spearheaded a radical anti-asylum movement. Following intense public and political struggle, the landmark Law 180 Basaglia Law, passed in 1978, effectively began closing large psychiatric hospitals and reframing care as community-based services. The promises in many places were elegant and compelling, with antipsychotic medication, social support, housing, and employment opportunities. People could live outside institutions and reclaim roles within families and public life. Yet practice proved uneven. Many promised community services never received the funding required to operate at scale. Political and economic pressures favored cost-saving bed closures, while new community centers often arrived late, understaffed, and under-resourced. In the gap between discharge and functioning community networks, many found themselves without ongoing care. What we now term trans-institutionalization emerged. Rather than returning to supported communities, individuals flowed into prison, shelters, and care homes, ill-equipped to manage long-term mental disabilities. Prisons increasingly became de facto mental health institutions. Visibly severely mentally ill populations appeared on metropolitan streets, with the social safety net fraying at its margins. The outcome is both tragic and predictable: cities with sharply reduced psychiatric beds, but no corresponding housing initiatives. See rising homelessness, prisons filled with individuals suffering untreated mental illness and substance use disorders. Families who once accompanied relatives in hospital wards now find themselves managing crises in living rooms, emergency departments, or queuing outside clinics. The rhetoric of liberation becomes complicated by these consequences. Freedom without resources is freedom to fall. Yet where promises are honored and investment follows through, better stories emerge. In 1972's America, a new model, assertive community treatment (ACT), emerged from the recognition that some individuals require multidisciplinary teams: nurses, social workers, psychiatrists, vocational specialists to provide home visits, street-level support, and practical assistance with housing and crisis management. Refined and extensively tested throughout the 1970s and 1980s, this model reduced hospitalizations and improved housing stability in well-resourced settings, supported employment in the form of the individual placement and support (IPS) model, developed by researchers Robert Drake and Gary Bond in the late 20th century. It provides an organized pathway back to work through rapid job placement and job support. These programs have elevated competitive employment rates for individuals with severe mental illness to levels far surpassing traditional vocational rehabilitation. Early psychosis intervention, pioneered in Australia during the 1990s by clinicians including Patrick McGarry, Gene Elbin's EPIC program, reframed schizophrenia as a time-sensitive condition. Early intervention following first psychotic episodes can reduce long-term disability. This model, combining rapid access to medication, family support, psychotherapy and vocational assistance, spread to the UK and other parts of the world in the 2000s, demonstrating that early, intensive and integrated care can alter disease trajectories. For the chronically homeless, the Housing First program, established in New York by SAMHSA BER, is in 1990 to demonstrated that providing stable housing without preconditions of sobriety or treatment leads to sustained housing retention and enables service engagement under humane conditions. These success stories convey us that pleasant medication alone is insufficient. When antipsychotic medication is integrated into programs offering housing, employment, case management, and early intervention, relapse rates decrease and social integration improve. When funding is inadequate, closing shelters merely shifts suffering elsewhere. Thus, the story of deinstitutionalization is both one of policy overextension and of missed opportunities. It recounts bright ideas implemented on a shoestring, as well as purposeful, adequately funded programs that genuinely transform lives. The arc from bodily experiments to pills to community care is not merely a timeline of technology. It is a narrative of shifting assumptions about what mental illness is and what society is willing to tolerate in its quest to control it. In the operating theatres and wards of the 1932nd and 1942nd, psychiatry practiced bold, often irreversible interventions, believing biology could be coerced into compliance. In the 1952nd and 60s, pharmacology suggested gentler, more reversible numerical manipulation. During the policy debates of the 1960s to 80s, politicians and clinicians envisioned a social architecture centered on medication. Though this framework was never fully realized, the community subsequently became the testing ground for whether medical triumphs could translate into social rehabilitation. Public trust in psychiatry fluctuated with each chapter. Drugs that quelled hallucinations inspired gratitude and compliance. Lobotomies that sapped vitality or electrovectors therapy that left memory gaps bred resentment and fear. The profession's authority expanded with advances in biological science, only to contract under the weight of abuses and unfulfilled promises. Patient advocacy and human rights movements emerged in response, insisting on informed consent, oversight, and community support respecting autonomy. Litigation and legislation followed. New standards of care emerged. The ethical reckoning was slow, uneven, and continued, yet over decades. The quieter, cumulative wisdom also grew. Clinicians and families learned to weigh risks and benefits in more nuanced ways. Researchers refined their questions, shifting from grand mechanistic claims to more nuanced models recognizing the roles of dopamine and glutamate, genetics and environment, developmental trajectories and social determinants. The language of recovery and supported inclusion entered policy documents and clinical manuals. Outcomes improved in areas of sustained investment following well-designed models. Early psychosis themes, proactive outreach, supported employment, housing minors first strategies. History is not linear. It weaves together hope and hubris. The body experiments were sometimes dramatic, occasionally beneficial, yet they also demonstrated the peril of acting upon limited evidence. The era of medication brought genuine relief to many, reshaping institutions and expectations, even as it introduced new harms and shifted focus away from social medicine. Deinstitutionalization reflected noble intentions and pragmatic savings. It succeeded where communities invested in services, and failed where budgets lagged behind rhetoric. The lessons are clear. Even if society learns slowly, treatments must be judged by their immediate effects and the systems surrounding them. Science without social support can be cruel rather than curative. In matters of the mind, ethics and evidence must walk hand in hand. As trials of community care unfolded at the societal level, a fierce battle raged within psychiatry over how to name and classify its core subject. The outcome of this struggle would profoundly shape research, treatment, and the lives of countless individuals. Emil Kreplin's legacy, a classification based on disease course and outcome, dominated the first half of the 20th century. Yet the concept of schizophrenia, introduced by Eugene Biarola, with its focus on splitting of mental function, charted an alternative course. Clinical practice, however, remained inconsistent. What one clinician observed as early onset dementia might be termed schizophrenia by another, while a third might label it a psychotic reaction. This confusion became untenable after the Second World War. With the advent of multinational research, epidemiological surveys, and later drug trials, a common language became imperative. In 1952, the World Health Organization published the 6th edition of the International Classification of Diseases, ICD-7, which included a chapter on mental disorders for the first time. That same year, the American Psychiatric Association, AP, released the first edition of the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual of Mental Disorders, DSM-I. These early manuals were heavily influenced by psychodynamic theory, featuring broad diagnostic descriptions laden with theoretical terminology. Pressure for change came from multiple fronts. The pharmacological revolution, emerging in the 1950s, demanded clear criteria to evaluate drug efficacy across specific patient groups. The deinstitutionalization movement of the 1960s and 70s required community services to accurately identify and plan for necessary resources. Concurrently, a powerful wave of criticism, often termed the uncertain anti-psychiatry movement, sharply questioned the reliability and validity of psychiatric diagnoses. In 1973, psychologist David Rosenhan published his renowned study, Sane People in Insane Places. He and 7 healthy companions feigned auditory hallucinations to gain admission to psychiatric hospitals, where all were diagnosed with mental disorders, primarily schizophrenia and hospitalists. After admission, they ceased reporting any symptoms and behaved entirely normally, yet remained hospitalized for an average of 19 days before discharge, still labeled as being in a remission phase. This study sent shockwaves through the psychiatric community, dramatically revealing the stickiness of diagnostic labels and the formidable power of institutional expectation. In response, and driven by broader medical trends towards operational definitions and reliability, a movement for diagnostic standard designates became imperative. Its leader was Robert Spitzer, a Columbia University psychiatrist with a strong preference for checklists and empirical data. Spitzer and his team set about radically reforming the diagnostic system. Their goal was to create a set of clear, symptom-based criteria that were as D-theorized as possible, enabling different clinicians to reach consistent diagnoses. In 1980, the DSM-II was published. It represented a radical revolution. It discarded most of the psychodynamic language found in the DSM-II and introduced specific, operational diagnostic criteria to be diagnosed with a particular disorder. A patient must exhibit a specific number of symptoms from the checklist, lasting for a specific duration, with other possibilities ruled out. For schizophrenia, DSM-II established stringent criteria, emphasizing symptom duration of at least 6 months and requiring impairment in social or occupational functioning. DSM-II pursued and significantly improved diagnostic reliability, consistency across clinicians. Yet questions regarding validity, whether diagnostic categories correspond to real, shared etiology, disease entities, remained unresolved. Schizophrenia became a useful clinical container in DSM-II, yet the heterogeneity within this container remained substantial. The reliability of subtypes such as paranoid, disorganized, and catatonic was notably low. The impact of DSM-II was profound. It became the gold standard for insurance reimbursement, disability assessments, epidemiological research, and clinical trials. It shifted the language of psychiatry from the consulting room to insurance companies and courts. Critics contended it reduced complex human suffering to tick-box criteria, fueling the medicalician of illness and the pathologician of social issues. Supporters praised its potential for rigor, clarity, and scientific progress. Subsequent revisions DSM-II-or, DSM-IV, DSM-V progressively refined the criteria. DSM-IV 2013 abolished schizophrenia subtype, acknowledging their limited clinical utility, and strengthened emphasis on dimensional assessments such as symptom severity. Concurrently, the World Health Organization's ICD system, currently ICD-11, has evolved, drawing from the DSM while maintaining subtle differences reflecting distinct philosophies and considerations of global applicability. This decades-long diagnostic revolution has fundamentally reshaped psychiatry. It has enabled large scale research, fueling explosive growth in genetics, neurogement, and therapeutic trials. Yet it has left a core dilemma: we have become increasingly adept at reliably classifying phenomena. But what exactly is the essence of these things we categorize? Is schizophrenia a single disease, or a collection of syndromes sharing common endpoints but differing in etiology? Do the DSM and ICD provide a map of disease, or merely a catalogue of symptoms? While diagnostic manuals were being compiled on desks, exploration in laboratories advanced at unprecedented speed. The technological leaps of the final decades of the 20th century, from molecular genetics to neurogement, opened new battlefields for understanding schizophrenia at the biological level. Early family, twin, and adoption studies have firmly established the significant role of genetic factors. The Condorcan trait of approximately 50% in monozygotic twins and around 15% in dizygotic twins indicates a robust genetic component to the risk, though not entirely determined by genes alone. But where is the uncertain schizophrenia gene? Initial efforts to identify a single, highly penetrant gene largely failed. This pointed to a more complex reality. Risk arises from the combined contribution of many genes, each adding only a small increment to the likelihood. Genome-wide association studies GWAS in the 21st century confirmed this. By comparing DNA from tens of thousands of patients on healthy controls, scientists identified hundreds of common genetic variant locations associated with schizophrenia risk. The impact of each variation is minuscule, yet collectively they constitute a polygenic risk. Furthermore, rare chromosomal copy number variations, such as 20 to Q11 to deletion syndrome, can substantially elevate risk, offering a unique window into potential mechanisms. Recent research has even begun pointing towards non-coding regions of the genome and the possible role of epigenetic mechanisms, how the environment influences gene expression. The narrative of genetics is no longer about identifying a single culprit, but rather about mapping a complex risk landscape composed of numerous minor pushes. This brings both hope: identifying pathways for intervention and challenges predicting individual risk remains extremely difficult and raises ethical dilemmas simultaneously. Neurogement techniques allow us to peer into the living brain. Computed tomography CT and magnetic resonance imaging MRI studies consistently reveal subtle yet measurable differences in the brains of individuals with schizophrenia: slightly enlarged ventricles, reduced gray matter volume in certain regions, such as the hippocampus and prefrontal cortex, and potential impairment in the integrity of white matter in different brain areas. These are not massive lesions, but rather widespread, nuanced variations. Functional magnetic resonance imaging, fMRI, reveals abnormal patterns of activity coordination between brain regions during cognitive or emotional tasks. A prominent theory, the disconnectivity hypothesis, posits that schizophrenia's core may lie in reduced communication efficiency between distinct brain networks rather than failure in any single region. Neurochemically, the classic dopamine hypothesis has been refined. It is now thought that subcortical pathways involved in reward and prediction may exhibit dopamine hyperactivity linked to positive symptoms such as hallucinations and delusions, while the prefrontal cortex involved in cognition and executive function, may show dopamine hyperfunction associated with negative symptoms and cognitive impairments. Dysfunction within the glutamate system, the brain's primary excitatory neurotransmitter, particularly via NMDA receptors, is considered another critical link, potentially indirectly contributing to dopamine dysregulation by affecting neural circuits. Linking these strands is the neurodullet-frontal hypothesis. This posits that schizophrenia does not emerge abruptly in adulthood, but rather results from deviations in early brain development. Risk factors may originate in the foetal period, maternal infections, malnutrition, obstetric complications, mild neuromotor or cognitive abnormalities may manifest in childhood. Subsequently, during adolescence, a critical period of extensive brain pruning and remodeling, an already vulnerable system may collapse under the combined influence of genetic predisposition and environmental stresses such as social pressures or cannabis use, precipitating the first psychotic episode. This integrated perspective, encompassing genetics, early development, adolescent neural remodeling, and environmental triggers, represents the most comprehensive current model. It explains why symptoms emerge in youth, why the disorder exhibits such heterogeneity, and why prevention and early intervention are paramount. Yet the story of schizophrenia extends far beyond genes and neurons. It is profoundly embedded within social structures, cultural meanings, and personal experiences. Perhaps one of the most enduring harms to patients and their families is stigma. The media frequently links schizophrenia with unpredictable violence, despite statistics clearly showing that individuals with the condition are more likely to be victims of violence than perpetrators. This stigma breeds fear, discrimination, employment difficulties, social isolation, and hinders people from seeking help. Anthropological research indicates that the content and meaning of psychotic experiences vary across cultures. In some societies, hearing voices may be interpreted as communication with ancestors or a spiritual gift, rather than necessarily a sign of ill. Differences in social acceptance and interpreted frameworks can significantly influence a patient's course of illness and level of suffering. Multinational research by the World Health Organization has found that in some developing countries, such as India and Nigeria, the long-term outcomes for schizophrenia are actually better than in industrialized nations. This may be linked to family support, societal role expectations, and lower levels of stigma. Over the past decades, a powerful recovery movement has emerged from patient advocacy. It emphasizes that recovery is not merely symptom elimination, but living a fulfilling, hopeful, and contributing life despite ongoing illness limitations. This encompasses rebuilding identity, establishing social connections, pursuing personal goals, and gaining autonomy. This philosophy has fostered patient-centered service models. Cognitive behavioral therapy (CBT) helps patients understand and manage their symptoms, challenging the credibility of delusional thoughts. Family interventions, educating families about the illness, improving communication, and reducing high emotional expression, criticism, and over-minus involvement within the household, have been shown to significantly lower relapse rates. Supported employment and education, assisting individuals in securing and maintaining positions within competitive workplace or educational settings. Peer support, guidance, and hope provided by those with similar lived experiences have proven immensely powerful. Voices network and similar movement go further, challenging the notion that hearing voices is inherently a pathological symptom requiring elimination. They provide safe spaces for voice hearers to share experiences, explore the meaning of voices, and learn strategies for coexisting with them, sometimes even embracing voices as a meaningful part of personal experience. Today, we stand at a complex historical juncture. We possess more effective medications and psychosocial interventions than ever before. Our understanding of genetics and neurobiology has grown exponentially. The philosophy of recovery is reshaping service systems. Yet significant challenges remain. A substantial unmet need for treatment. Many individuals respond poorly to existing medications or cannot tolerate their side effects. Negative symptoms and cognitive impairments remain difficult to treat. Insufficient and unequal healthcare resources globally, particularly in low-income regions. Mental health services are severely lacking, even in affluent nations. Community support is often underfunded and fragmented. Comorbidite and premature mortality. Individuals with schizophrenia frequently experience substance abuse, cardiovascular disease, and diabetes, with an average life expectancy 10-20 years shorter than the general population. Human rights and autonomy striking a balance between safeguarding individual safety in rare genuinely dangerous situations and respecting patient autonomy, while avoiding involuntary treatment, remains a focal point of intense ethical and legal debate. The future holds both promise and uncertainty. Precision psychiatry aims to utilize genetic and biomarker information to match individuals with the most effective treatments. Digital tools, such as mobile applications, may be employed for symptom monitoring, delivering interventions, and facilitating connections. Research into novel mechanisms, including the immune system and gut microbiome, is ongoing. Concurrently, strengthening community support systems, addressing social determinants such as poverty and discrimination, and continuing the fight against stigma are no less crucial than biomedical breakthroughs. The history of schizophrenia is a chronicle of humanity's understanding, fear, compassion, attempts to control, and endeavors to cure the deepest disorders of the mind, from ancient exorcisms to medieval asylums, from Victorian minus hospitals to the reckless era of somatic treatments, from the pill revolution to the arduous attempts at community care, and into today's complex world of gene sequencing and brain imaging. The path has been long and winding, intertwined with science and superstition, benevolence and cruelty, hope and despair. It reminds us that mental illness is not merely a disease of the brain, but also a disease of society. The most effective treatment must encompass both neurochemically regulating drugs and social structures that provide connection, meaning, and opportunity. It demands we maintain scientific curiosity and humility, guard against reducing people to diagnostic labels, and forever place the dignity and experience of the patient at the heart of our endeavors. This story is far from over. Each generation faces the task of confronting this ancient challenge with the tools and values of its own time. What we do today, how we fund research, organize services, shape legislation, and treat one another in daily life will become the next chapter in the annals of future historians. The goal should not merely be symptom control, but to help every person affected with a meaningful and whole life story, however challenging the circumstances.